The hills of Appalachia breathe with a rhythm older than war, older than the silence that followed the bombs. At dusk, their ridges fold into one another like a series of blankets laid across the sleeping body of the earth. The horizon glows with a fading wash of color, amber, then rose, then violet, until the night itself begins to draw its curtain across the land. Even in the age after fire, the valley does not forget how to rest. The air softens, touched by the faint scent of pine needles warming after the day's sun and the hush of crickets calling out their layered chorus. Between the trees, the broken lines of old roads curve downward into shadows. Rusting bridges stand like ribs of forgotten beasts. Yet the landscape is not empty. It is attended quietly by those who chose to remain. The survivors of Appalachia did not carve their legacies into monuments. They left them instead in softer places, in tended fields, in mended fences, in stories carried across kitchen tables. They were not always celebrated in life. Many were never named in histories, but they were remembered all the same, not as warriors who claimed victories, but as guardians who offered steadiness. At dusk, the work of the day slowed, and one could see the shape of their world most clearly. It was in the small rituals, lanterns lit at the doorways of rebuilt cabins. A pot of stew stirred, its scent drifting across the hollows. A hand pressing against the worn wood of a door frame, checking that it still held firm. These routines anchored a life that might otherwise have dissolved into chaos. In Charleston, once a city of towering glass and steel, the evenings fell differently. The skyline had been broken, its tallest structures melted into skeletal ruins. Yet along its riverbanks, people gathered. They repaired fishing nets, their hands moving with patient repetition. They cleaned tools in the dimming light, laying them in neat rows as if order itself could become a kind of prayer. The faint glow of makeshift braziers reflected against their faces, each illuminated just enough to be recognized by those nearby. And further south, among the hollows and hills, families settled into quieter rhythms. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, a guitar string hummed softly, a tune shaped for comfort rather than performance. Dogs settled near fire pits. Children were hushed by lullabies whose words had survived from before the war, carrying forward a thread of continuity across generations. The valley at dusk was not a time of danger. It was a time of counting, of pausing, of noting what had been mended and what still needed tending. Those who lived here understood that survival was not simply endurance. It was a matter of care. In that care, certain names began to echo, not loudly, but steadily. They were remembered not through grand tales of combat, but through small acts that resonated in the community. The heroes of Appalachia, as some later called them, were not always warriors. They were healers, archivists, farmers, singers, wanderers, and watchers. They made the land livable again, one quiet gesture at a time. Yet in those early evenings, no one spoke of heroes. The people of Appalachia thought instead of neighbors. They thought of those who had repaired a well pump, who had shared seed grain, who had taken the time to teach a child to read. The stories of the fading stars, as they would later be called, began in this space, ordinary kindness magnified by memory. Across the ridges, the sky shifted toward a deeper indigo. The first stars appeared, distant, steady, though faint against the atmosphere's lingering haze. Survivors sometimes looked upward at them, wondering if these points of light had seen the firestorms below and what they remembered of the world before. In the hush of that wondering, a phrase began to circulate, though none could say precisely where it started. The fading stars. It was a phrase spoken not with sorrow, but with a kind of reverence. The stars were not fading because they were weak. They were fading because their time was finite, because they were meant to give light for a season and then yield. The people remembered individuals in the same way, as passing brightness, never permanent, yet never meaningless. The first chapter of this story, then, is not about a single figure. It is about the setting, the valley itself, and the rhythm it gave to those who lived there. The land was not silent. It was attentive. The sound of a stream crossing rocks, the hum of insects in tall grass, the creak of a cabin door settling on its hinge, each was part of a larger song, one that steadied those who listened. One might picture, in that twilight, a lone figure walking along an abandoned rail line. Their steps are measured, not hurried. They carry a lantern, its light swaying gently across the weeds that push through cracked boards. They pause now and then, noting the sound of frogs in the marsh or kneeling to adjust a loose strap. It is not the image of a warrior returning from battle. It is the image of a caretaker moving through the valley as if to remind it that it is still seen. These were the beginnings of remembrance. No proclamations, no banners, no declarations of victory, just the steady act of being present. And it is in this quiet presence that the notion of heroism shifts. From conquest to care, from permanence to fleeting acts that ripple outward in ways no one could predict. The dusk deepens. The lantern glow fades from view. The hills fold into shadow once more. But tomorrow the valley will awaken again, and with it, the routines that define a people who chose not to vanish. And so we begin, not with an ending, but with a promise. That within these hills, stories remain to be uncovered. Stories of those who tended, who repaired, who remembered. Stories of the fading stars. Soft hinge to Chapter 2. As the valley rests under its blanket of night, the question lingers. What was the daily work of these caretakers? What small routines filled their mornings, and what did they believe worth preserving in a world remade by silence? Morning in Appalachia did not announce itself with trumpets or alarms. It came slowly, like a hand drawing back a curtain, letting light spill into rooms that had learned to live without electricity. The sun rose over ridgelines softened by mist, its warmth catching in the dew that clung to grass and shattered glass alike. A rooster might crow from a hollow where chickens still scratched. Dogs stirred by thresholds, stretching with a quiet groan. The air carried the cool dampness of the night, gradually giving way to the sharper scents of wood smoke, soil, and iron. In those first hours, people began the quiet work of tending. It was not glamorous, and it was not recorded in histories, but it was the foundation on which survival rested. Every morning, the valley came alive, not with shouts or gunfire, but with measured routines, tasks carried out with care, patience, and a sense of continuity. At a small farmstead outside Flatwoods, a woman bent to check the rows of beans she had planted in soil cleared of rubble. Her hands moved with steady precision, plucking away weeds that had crept in overnight. She pressed the earth around the young stalks, firm but gentle, whispering words of encouragement as though the plants could hear her. A bucket of water, drawn by rope from a hand-dug well, was poured slowly along the furrows. The soil drank it in with a soft hiss, and the green leaves seemed to lift themselves slightly, grateful for the morning gift. Nearby, her neighbor worked on a different task, repairing a section of fence. The wood was salvaged from ruined houses, stripped of nails, reshaped into posts and rails. His hammering was not hurried. Each strike of the nail was measured, ensuring the boards sat flush, the line of the fence even. When the last plank was secured, he stepped back to admire the work. It was not perfect, but it held. In a world where so much had collapsed, the ability to make something hold was no small triumph. In Charleston, where the river cut through the remains of skyscrapers, another kind of tending took place. At dawn, fishermen prepared their lines. Their movements were practiced, uncoiling string, checking hooks, patching tears in nets that had snagged on debris. The rhythm of their preparation carried an unspoken dignity. Each knot tied was an affirmation. The river still provided, and their hands still knew how to gather its gifts. When the first fish was pulled in, its silver body flashing in the morning light, the catch was less a bounty than a reassurance. Life still moved in the waters. Elsewhere, mechanics turned their attention to machines left standing in rust and silence. Water purifiers, their panels dented and their filters clogged, were coaxed back to life with improvised parts. Old motors hummed uncertainly, then steadied as hands, adjusted valves and replaced corroded wiring. These repairs were not loud victories, but they were transformative. Clean water meant fewer fevers. A functioning generator meant a lamp lit in a child's bedroom. The work was meticulous, often frustrating, but deeply rewarding. There were archivists, too, not of armies or governments, but of people. In makeshift shelters, they arranged letters, journals, photographs. Pages were pressed flat beneath stones, ink traced with cautious fingers. The archivists did not know who would read these collections in the future, but they knew they mattered. Memory was a kind of nourishment, and if the past were left untended, it might vanish like mist. One man, bent over a cracked desk, carefully copied a fragment of song lyrics from a page that was too fragile to survive handling. His handwriting was steady, his lips silently mouthing the words as he wrote. He paused occasionally to sharpen the stub of his pencil against a piece of sandpaper. In the corner, a lantern flickered, its wick trimmed and adjusted until the flame burned low and even. Tending, in all its forms, was a rhythm. It stitched the day together, making the hours less about survival and more about continuity. These were not extraordinary acts. They were ordinary ones done well, and in their repetition, they became a kind of quiet heroism. It is in these details, the sharpening of a tool, the folding of cloth, the turning of soil, that we glimpse what it meant to endure after the Great War. It was not enough to fight. One had to care. One had to tend. And yet, within this quiet work, small mysteries emerged. Among the letters that archivists gathered, certain phrases repeated. In the margins of otherwise ordinary notes, a symbol sometimes appeared. A 5-pointed star, sketched hastily, often half-faded. Beside it, names were written, though many were smudged, incomplete or crossed out. For now, the archivists did not know what it meant. Perhaps it was a signature, perhaps a code, or perhaps something more symbolic, more intangible. The phrase that accompanied it on rare occasions, the fading stars, was left unexplained. But the archivists, like the farmers and the mechanics, understood the value of patience. Answers did not arrive all at once. They had to be cultivated, like beans in the field, like nets cast in the river. And so they copied the symbol when they found it. They tucked the fragments into folders. They whispered about it quietly, sometimes by lamplight, curious but unhurried. It was enough for now to notice. The work of tending was not only about repairing what was broken. It was about noticing what might otherwise go unseen. The patient gardener noticed the first sprout among stones. The mechanic noticed the faint change in a motor's hum that signaled success. The archivist noticed a smudge of ink that others might have overlooked. These acts of noticing were themselves a form of care. As evening drew near again, the day's tasks gave way to the soft rituals of rest. Tools were cleaned, wiped free of soil or grease, and placed neatly in their places. Livestock were counted and secured. Nets were hung to dry. Lamps were lit, and meals shared. In these moments, the valley held itself steady, cradled by the competence of its people. And though no one declared themselves a hero, the valley remembered. The earth held the footprints of those who tended it. The journals and letters held their handwriting. The fences and repaired bridges bore the mark of their hands. These small inheritances accumulated, giving shape to a memory that would outlast them. It is here, among the quiet work of tending, that the story of the fading stars begins to take form. Not as warriors, not as conquerors, but as caretakers. Their heroism was not thunderous. It was steady, rhythmic, and enduring. The valley, in its dusk and dawn, bore witness. Soft hinge to Chapter 3. Among the countless pages and notes preserved by Appalachia's patient archivists, one fragment stood out. A small sketch in the margins, a star faintly drawn, accompanied by names now almost lost to smudge and time. It was a quiet summer morning in Las Cruces when the first rumors began to circulate. The sun hung heavy in the sky, baking the desert floor until the soil cracked like old parchment. Beneath this landscape lay the history of New Mexico, its pueblos, its battlefields, its lonely cemeteries scattered along forgotten trails. Yet one burial ground, more than any other, seemed to resist silence. The Withers children, those 3 small coffins lowered into the dry earth in 1856, had already been reburied more times than most families could imagine. Each disturbance carried with it whispers of unease, of shifting earth and misplaced stones. Yet the story might have ended there, had the ground itself not begun to move. Gravediggers in the late 19th century swore that the Withers plot would not hold. The soil around their resting place collapsed again and again, as if some unseen hand pressed from below. Coffins sank, markers tilted. When the men set their spades to restore the ground, they described the soil as loose, as though it had been turned only hours before, though no one had touched it. Neighbors spoke of hollow sounds beneath their boots when they crossed near the cemetery. A dull, echoing thud rose from below, as if the earth concealed a cavern. Others claimed to hear children's voices in the wind, faint as sighs, carried across the graveyard fence. Farmers passing on horseback dismounted to listen, but when they pressed an ear to the soil, there was only silence. The parish priest at the time, Father Clemente, noted in his ledger that he ordered the ground blessed no less than 4 times between 1870 and 1875, 1885. Still, he wrote in careful Spanish, the land rejects peace. It does not accept these little ones. Each attempt at burial seems undone by the desert itself. His records show that he considered the possibility of reinterring the Withers children in consecrated stone vaults, but funds, as always, ran short. The parish could do little more than offer prayer and salt scattered across the earth. By the turn of the century, the tale had passed beyond local rumor. Travelers, journalists, and curiosity seekers arrived in Las Cruces to hear the family curse to move their children's remains. Some accused the desert winds, others the settling fault lines beneath the valley. Yet the locals spoke with conviction. This was not a matter of nature. This was resistance. One story tells of a ranch hand named Miguel, who in 1902 leaned against the fence bordering the plot while smoking his evening cigarette. The wind had died, the night stretched still and wide. Then, with no tremor of warning, the soil in the children's corner sank a full inch before his eyes, as though the ground exhaled. Startled, Miguel dropped his match and fled. When others returned at dawn, the soil bore a shallow depression across the graves. In the decades that followed, the phenomenon continued. Each new attempt at reburial was met with collapse. Graves that should have rested undisturbed for years required attention within months. Families buried near the Withers children sometimes requested their kin be moved elsewhere, unwilling to share the restless earth. The cemetery records show an unusual number of relocations between 1910 and 1925, all drawn from the row nearest the Withers plot. It was in 1933 that the 13th and final reburial took place. By then, the Withers' parents had long since passed, their remains laid elsewhere in ground that kept its silence. Only their children, it seemed, carried the burden of movement. The city council authorized a more permanent stone encasement for the coffins, ordering masons to construct vaults deep into the desert floor. Workers described the dig as difficult, the soil shifting beneath their shovels as though stirred from below. One laborer, an older man who had spent decades on such tasks, swore to his dying day that the earth there was alive in a way it should not have been. And yet the vaults were finished, the coffins were lowered, the 13th reburial was carried out with solemnity, the priest murmuring blessings over stone rather than sand. The cemetery records note this as the last disturbance, as if the ground had finally been sealed. But those who lived in Las Cruces at the time told another story, that even after the vaults were set, the land remained uneasy. Grass refused to grow over that patch. Rain pooled there longer than elsewhere, as though the ground did not wish to absorb it. By the middle of the 20th century, the tale of the Withers children was no longer local legend. It had become part of the fabric of New Mexican folklore. Travelers would stop to ask where the restless graves lay. Writers included them in collections of ghost stories, though often with embellishment. Some said the coffins had been found open. Others claimed that the children's names could no longer be read on their stones, no matter how often they were carved anew. But beneath the embroidery of rumor, the records remained. 13 burials, 13 refusals. Even today, researchers examining the cemetery archives can trace the sequence in careful handwriting, the shifting of coffins, the collapses of soil, the complaints of neighbors, and though official explanations point to erosion, to subsidence, to the restless geology of the Mesilla Valley, those who stand before the site know the truth feels heavier. It is not only the land that rejects peace. Something beneath it resists. The Withers children remain in their stone vaults, unmoved since 1933. Yet the legend endures that should the earth ever be stirred again, the restless ground will rise to remind the living of its refusal. The 13th burial was not an ending but only a pause. And in the long silence of the desert night, when the wind cuts low across the graves, some say the hollow sound still echoes beneath the soil. By the mid-20th century, the story of the Withers children had begun to move quietly beyond Las Cruces, carried not in official records alone, but in the rhythms of conversation. It traveled on the winds of New Mexico, drifting across deserts and mountains, into the homes of travelers, historians, and those simply curious about the odd, unsettled corners of the world. This chapter is not about spectacle. It is about listening, the way stories live between voices, carried in tone, hesitation, and repetition long before they are written down. Residents of the valley recalled grandparents murmuring the tale beside their hearths, often in hushed voices, as if the children might overhear. Words were chosen with care, the story softened over time, losing details that were sharp or alarming, preserving instead a quiet unease. In the evenings, after chores were completed and animals settled, families would gather and speak of the Withers plot as a cautionary tale of respect. Respect for the dead, respect for the land, respect for the fragile balance between them. Visitors from afar were struck not by terror, but by the consistency of the narrative. Those who traveled west along Route 70 in the 1940s found guides eager to recount the legend, each adding local flourishes. A rancher would mention the children's voices carried by the wind. A shopkeeper would note that grass refused to grow over the vault. Yet beneath these details lay a pattern of persistence, a series of small markers that gave the story coherence across decades. The oral tradition also revealed what written records could not, the subtle emotional texture of the community's response. The neighbors were not afraid in the dramatic sense. They were attentive, respectful, and cautious. Some spoke of leaving offerings, small toys, coins, or flowers on the graves, a gesture of empathy that reflected not superstition, but care. In telling and retelling the story, people reinforced a form of moral stewardship over the land, emphasizing patience and attentiveness rather than spectacle or fear. Folklorists visiting Las Cruces in the 1950s noted this tone with quiet fascination. They recorded interviews with elderly residents who remembered when each reburial took place. One woman, her hands folded in her lap, recalled standing at the cemetery fence as a girl and watching the diggers lower the 13th vault. She described the soil settling oddly beneath the shovels, forming gentle depressions and ridges. "It was like the land was breathing," she said softly, as though even the smallest exhalation might disturb something sacred. This idea of the earth itself communicating persisted in other stories, told around kitchen tables and in schoolyards. Children who grew up hearing these stories described a subtle awareness. When walking near the plot, the ground felt slightly springy, the air carried a faint chill, and the shadows of the fence seemed longer than they should have been. They were attuned not to threat, but to a delicate rhythm of presence, a quiet interaction with the unseen. Some of the oral accounts also carried hints of the practical. Farmers described noticing that their own soil near the cemetery behaved strangely, tighter in texture, slow to absorb rain. Mechanics and laborers who worked in the area found small tools inexplicably misplaced or buried just beneath the surface, as though the ground itself was moving things to preserve order. These subtle anomalies reinforced the sense that the land, while not sentient in the dramatic sense, had patterns that demanded observation and care. The pattern extended further still. Letters sent between families in New Mexico occasionally referenced the Withers plot indirectly, using coded language or metaphor. A farmer might write of a restless patch, or a teacher might mention 3 little stars in the sand. These fragments contributed to a growing network of remembrance, oral and written, that spanned households, generations, and geography. Even without fully understanding the cause of the disturbances, the community engaged in a form of attentive stewardship. By the 1960s, a new layer of interpretation emerged. Anthropologists and folklorists began to analyze the tales systematically. They traced consistent motifs, the repeated collapse of soil, the peculiar behavior of plants over the graves, the echoes heard in the night. Yet they also noted the tone of the storytellers. Emphasis was placed not on horror, but on continuity, on the careful observation of patterns over time. The legend of the Withers children was not a tale of fright. It was a narrative about attentiveness and moral care. Through the oral tradition, then, a paradoxical pattern developed. The story was both incomplete and complete. Incomplete in that details shifted, names were forgotten, and embellishments crept in. Complete in that the core, children moved repeatedly. Soil unsettled, the land watched, remained constant. The repeated motifs were like ripples on water, each iteration reinforcing the memory of the place without needing spectacle. And yet, even as the story spread, small mysteries persisted. Listeners often asked questions that went unanswered. Why did the soil refuse to hold the children? Why did the phenomenon affect only that particular plot? Could there have been some unseen factor, geology, hydrology, or something more subtle that shaped these disturbances? These questions, unhurried and open-ended, were woven into the oral fabric. They offered curiosity without alarm, engagement without distress. In the evenings, as storytellers passed the tale along, the desert outside seemed to participate. The wind whispered across the graves, rustling grass that was uneven or sparse. A distant coyote howled, a soft and measured note that punctuated the pauses in the tale. Children and adults alike listened, leaning in slightly, drawing lessons in attentiveness, patience, and quiet respect from the rhythm of repetition. Through all these oral traces, the story gained texture and resilience. The Withers children's plot became not only a physical location, but a repository of memory, observation, and care. The repeated acts of storytelling reinforced both ethical attention and cultural continuity. In these ways, the narrative extended beyond mere history into lived experience, a gentle, ongoing dialogue between the community and the land itself. The oral traces also foreshadowed later discoveries. While written records and physical anomalies would eventually attract researchers, the foundation laid by generations of attentive listeners ensured that the story remained meaningful. It was not the dramatic flourish of a single investigator or sensationalist account that preserved the memory. It was the daily practice of noticing, describing, and sharing in the quiet hush of kitchens, schools, and porches across New Mexico. By dusk, the pattern became visible once more. Families would pause, reflecting on what they had heard that day. The wind carried the faint scent of desert blooms, the warmth of sun-soaked stones, and the lingering presence of a story that demanded nothing from its listeners but attention. The valley itself seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging that it was still observed, still understood, still respected. Soft hinge to Chapter 5. Among these oral traces, subtle physical signs began to emerge. Bridges, fences, and soil patterns hinted at hands that had interacted with the land in ways unnoticed by casual observation. The next chapter turns to these landmarks of memory, where the tangible traces of caretaking and quiet heroism become visible, guiding us to the material evidence of attentiveness alongside story. The land of Appalachia and the deserts of New Mexico are more than geography. They are repositories of memory. In the quiet rhythm of post-war life, the people who lived there found that the stories they told, the rituals they carried out, and the objects they preserved all left traces on the earth itself. These traces, subtle and often overlooked, became landmarks of memory, markers not of grandeur, but of attentiveness, endurance, and care. Along old highways and forgotten trails, small stone piles marked the edges of tended gardens, fenced fields, or hidden wells. They were not monuments, yet they carried weight. Each stone had been placed by hands that labored slowly and thoughtfully, selected for balance, shape, and texture. Some were stacked to guide rainwater toward crops, others to signal boundaries for animals. Over decades, these humble constructions persisted, standing as silent witnesses to those who had gone before. In Las Cruces, the cemetery offered another form of landmark. The Withers children's plot, reburied 13 times, was encased finally in stone vaults, but around the perimeter, shrubs were planted deliberately to mark lines, paths cleared so that visitors could walk without disturbing the graves. These shrubs, often native desert species, grew slowly, but they endured, becoming natural signposts of care. Their placement followed no survey map or ordinance, only the attentive judgment of people who knew the land and honored it. Across the valleys of Appalachia, similar landmarks existed in forms less permanent but no less meaningful. A repaired fence post, its paint faded, stood beside a tree that had been planted decades earlier. A gate swung smoothly after a neighbor had oiled its hinges. Even a worn path between cabins held significance. It traced habitual movements, the quiet rhythms of tending, of visiting, of checking on wells or livestock. The land was read like a text, and those who understood its language could tell where care had been given, where attention lingered, and where absence had left its mark. Mechanics, carpenters, and blacksmiths contributed as well. Rusted tools left at the side of a road or carefully hung in a workshop offered subtle evidence of routine and precision. A repaired plow, its blade sharpened and straight, or a mended wheel spoke of steady hands and practiced eyes. These landmarks did not demand attention, yet those who recognized them understood that they signified more than mere function. They signified continuity and vigilance. The children of Appalachia and New Mexico learned these signs as well. Even if they did not know the full story of the Withers children, they understood how the land could communicate. A stone moved slightly from the wind, a patch of soil left soft and undisturbed, a shrub leaning subtly in a certain direction, all became cues to behavior, reminders of respect, patterns to follow. In this way, physical markers reinforced oral memory, and oral memory gave significance to the land. Alongside these more obvious markers were subtler ones. Gardeners left impressions in the soil, furrows pressed into the earth to direct water. Walkers left footprints that, over time, pressed into paths worn in grass and gravel. Even the arrangement of discarded objects, pots, tools, and scraps of wood, became tacit communication, a silent record of care. Observers noted patterns and inferred routines, the daily check of the wells, the weekly mending of fences, the seasonal planting and harvesting. These activities, repeated across years, became embedded in the very texture of the land. In the desert, too, patterns were observed. The Withers plot may have resisted settlement, but nearby graves, fences, and roads showed human intention. Small depressions where stones had been moved, slight rises in the soil from buried posts, and vegetation arranged in deliberate lines all offered tangible evidence of past labor. Scholars and folklorists visiting the area in the mid-20th century noted that these markers, though modest, were consistent across the region. They spoke not of wealth or prominence, but of careful stewardship, a persistent, understated presence. One archivist visiting the Las Cruces Cemetery in 1958 described the scene with a quiet fascination. The fences were imperfect, yet stable. Shrubs leaned thoughtfully over vaults. Paths had been brushed free of debris, worn smooth by repeated footsteps. The archivist traced the edges with gloved fingers, feeling the subtle ridges in the soil, noting the faint depressions where someone had knelt to plant or repair. Each of these details, seemingly trivial, spoke of intentional action, an enduring attentiveness that bridged generations. The landmarks also carried symbolic weight. The repeated act of tending the soil, repairing fences, planting shrubs, and arranging stones reinforced the ethical dimension of care. The land itself became a teaching tool, offering lessons about patience, precision, and mindfulness. It demonstrated, gently but clearly, that attention could leave lasting traces, that memory was not only a matter of recollection, but of tangible intervention. These subtle markers connected communities across space and time. A child learning to follow the path between houses in Appalachia encountered the same principles as a family planting around the Withers Vault in New Mexico. In both cases, observation was rewarded, noticing small shifts, responding with care, preserving continuity. It was a culture of attentiveness transmitted not through authority, but through action, repetition, and subtle cues embedded in the environment. And yet, some anomalies persisted even among these careful landmarks. In Las Cruces, a shrub occasionally shifted overnight, a stone moved inexplicably, a small depression appeared where no one had been. In Appalachia, fences sometimes leaned as though touched by unseen hands. The caretakers, while skilled and patient, recognized that some patterns in the land were beyond immediate explanation. They recorded them, noted them, and incorporated them into their understanding of the environment. These small uncertainties became another form of memory, a reminder that observation and respect were ongoing responsibilities. It is in these physical traces, these landmarks of memory, that the narrative of post-war life becomes tangible. Stories alone are insufficient. Objects, arrangements, and the earth itself hold the evidence of human attentiveness. Every repaired fence, every furrowed field, every planted shrub carries a lesson in care, continuity, and persistence. The landscape is not inert. It is responsive. It bears witness. As the sun set across hills and desert flats, the landmarks took on new meaning. Shadows stretched over fences, pools of water reflected the evening sky, and subtle variations in the soil caught the last rays of light. Those who walked these paths, tending, observing, and remembering, found reassurance in the rhythm of the land. It had been watched, it had been cared for, and it continued to hold the memory of those who had labored quietly, steadily, and thoughtfully. Soft hinge to Chapter 6. Amid these landmarks, another layer of history began to reveal itself. Not only human labor, but the faint traces of journeys, notes, and artifacts left behind in the margins. Objects and inscriptions, often overlooked, hinted at untold stories, waiting to be discovered by those willing to observe with patience and attention. In quiet corners of libraries, homes, and small archives across New Mexico, traces of history often appeared where one least expected them, in the margins. Notes scribbled on faded paper, sketches pressed into the corners of journals, and small symbols penciled in alongside official records. These subtle markings were evidence of attention, observation, and care. They were not dramatic or urgent. They were quiet footprints of those who lived through, witnessed, or simply remembered the unusual, persistent story of the Withers children. Archivists noted these margins with reverent patience. A single sheet of paper from a mid-19th century ledger might contain lists of reburials, dates, and the names of caretakers, all precise and orderly. In the corner, however, someone had drawn a small five-pointed star, its points uneven but deliberate. Occasionally, the name of a child would appear beside it, sometimes smudged, sometimes carefully underlined. The meaning of these marks was unclear, but the repetition suggested an intentional pattern. An index, a symbol, or perhaps a mnemonic device for remembering details that mattered most. Families in Las Cruces and nearby settlements preserved similar traces. A mother might annotate a ledger with a note about soil conditions, a rainstorm, or the subtle tilt of a gravestone. A teacher copying the tale of the Withers children into a local history book might add a star or asterisk in the margins, signaling something of interest without elaboration. These seemingly minor acts were, in fact, ways of encoding memory, ensuring that certain observations would not vanish even as stories evolved over generations. The margins also revealed connections across time and space. Comparing notes from different households, researchers discovered the same symbols recurring in different hands. Stars, simple geometric shapes, and coded annotations appeared in diaries, letters, and burial records alike. Though no single key explained them, the presence of these marginalia suggested that the community shared not only stories, but a method of attentive recording. It was a system that valued observation above conjecture, detail above dramatization. In one archival box, a stack of letters dated between 1875 and 1890 contained references to a soft patch near the Withers plot. In most letters, the phrase was written in ordinary ink, but in the margins, caretakers had added arrows, small stars, and brief phrases such as "check after rain" or "soil still shifts." These annotations were practical, yet poetic in their restraint. They reflected a calm attentiveness, an ongoing relationship with the land and the memory of the children. The act of noting in the margins became a gentle ritual. Each time a page was turned or a ledger opened, the observer reaffirmed their presence, their care, and their commitment to preserving continuity. It was a quiet, almost meditative practice. One could trace the progression of concern over decades. The earliest notes concerned soil and water. Later entries referenced vaults and shrubbery. Still later annotations addressed patterns in vegetation and subtle changes in the cemetery. Through these marginal traces, the land itself seemed to communicate indirectly, teaching lessons about patience, attentiveness, and the long-term consequences of neglect. Researchers, both professional and amateur, approached these margins as if decoding a language of care. They found that the symbols often corresponded with landmarks of memory, aligning with fences, stone piles, planted shrubs, and repaired fences. A small star in a notebook might indicate a fence post leaning slightly after a rainstorm or a depression in the soil at a particular grave. Over time, these connections painted a richer picture. The community was not only observing, but cross-referencing, creating a living map of interactions between people and land. Even the children of these communities participated in the marginal practice. School assignments, hand-copied journals, and sketches all contained tiny annotations, lines under words, stars in corners, subtle underlining. It was not formal instruction, it was absorbed behavior, passed along through example and repetition. They learned to notice, to record, and to honor what might otherwise be overlooked. By the early 20th century, some marginal notes became physical markers. A sketch of a star in a ledger might correspond to a small pile of stones placed near a grave or a bent fence post repaired, and marked with chalk. These intersections of paper and land, of notation and observation, demonstrate the seamless relationship between story, attention, and action. The act of recording in the margins was inseparable from the act of caring for the land. One of the more compelling examples appeared in a teacher's journal from 1922. She had copied letters from Las Cruces residents describing the 13th reburial of the Withers children. In the margins, she sketched stars and notes about the soil's behavior. Later, when visiting the site, she discovered that her notes corresponded to slight depressions in the desert earth, tiny irregularities that aligned with her markings. For her, the act of writing became a way of mapping attention, a gentle bridge between observation and understanding. The beauty of marginal traces lay in their subtlety. They demanded no immediate response, offered no alarms, and carried no rush of urgency. Instead, they encouraged quiet reflection. Each annotation was a signpost. Notice this. Attend to this. Remember this. Across decades and generations, these notes created a lattice of understanding, linking human observation to physical and cultural memory. The repeated patterns, recorded in the margins, also prepared the way for the eventual recognition of the fading stars, the small stars, notes, and sketches that would later be understood as a network of attentiveness. They were not evidence of threat or supernatural design, but evidence of careful, patient observation. In the quiet, these symbols acted as guides, subtle reminders that care and attention leave traces that can endure far longer than any single individual. And so, the story continued. Observers, archivists, families, and children all left their notes, marks, and symbols, quietly contributing to a collective memory that was tangible, verifiable, and enduring. These marginal traces connected generations, reminding them that even small acts of observation matter, that attention can persist, and that human presence can gently shape the landscape without force or spectacle. The marginal notes, stars, and arrows were more than symbols. They pointed to patterns in the landscape that would only reveal themselves through careful exploration. In the next chapter, we follow these subtle clues, tracing the hidden paths and quiet alignments that link story, land, and memory across decades. In the decades after the 13th reburial of the Withers children, observers began to notice subtle patterns in the land that seemed to correspond with the stories, marginal notes, and landmarks passed down over generations. These were not trails blazed by feet alone, nor paths designed for convenience. They were quiet pathways, often invisible to the casual eye, that connected graves, stone markers, shrubs, and fences in a deliberate, though understated, lattice. Scholars, folklorists, and attentive locals referred to these as quiet paths. Walking them required care, patience, and an awareness of the land's rhythms. A misstep might obscure a depression in the soil or disturb a small pile of stones that had been carefully arranged. Those who followed these paths learned to read subtle cues, the lean of a post, the spacing of shrubs, the gentle slope of the terrain. Each detail acted as a guide, directing attention without instruction, offering insight without urgency. In Las Cruces, the cemetery itself provided the clearest examples. The paths around the Withers vaults were not straight lines. They curved gently, tracing depressions in the soil where previous caretakers had walked, kneeling to adjust shrubs, check soil moisture, or steady a vault lid. Shadows cast by the setting sun revealed irregularities in the ground, small ridges, soft hollows that were invisible at midday. These irregularities served as markers, subtle reminders of attention and presence. Observers reported that following the quiet paths required a certain rhythm. Steps were slow, measured, and deliberate. Eyes scanned the soil, the alignment of stones, and the edges of shrubs. Attention was drawn to patterns. A set of footprints repeated in stone, a small patch of soil consistently softer than surrounding ground, or a shrub that leaned in a direction that suggested repeated care. Each observation reinforced memory, connecting past actions with present awareness. Beyond the cemetery, paths extended across the surrounding desert. Travelers, farmers, and ranchers noticed similar patterns. Fences, stone piles, and carefully placed markers guided movement, directing attention subtly to key areas: a buried water pipe, a vulnerable patch of soil, or a shallow depression signaling previous disturbances. These paths were not designed for efficiency. They were created through repeated attentiveness, a human presence layered over the natural landscape, acting as both guide and memory. Folklorists and historians began to document these alignments in the mid-20th century, mapping the positions of stone markers. Shrub placements and fence posts revealed a network of directional cues, often corresponding with marginal notes in ledgers and journals. Stars drawn in the corners of pages matched subtle arrangements of stones on the ground. Arrows penciled in margins mirrored the gentle curves of paths between graves or fields. In this way, the quiet paths were not only physical but mnemonic, encoding memory into the landscape itself. Even small objects contributed. Tools left temporarily in a corner, a carefully placed shard of pottery, or a discarded bucket might mark the edge of a path. These items were rarely conspicuous. They did not announce themselves. They merely existed as subtle anchors. Those who moved among them learned to recognize patterns of placement, developing an intuitive understanding of the landscape's rhythms. The quiet paths became both guides and teachers, offering lessons in patience, observation, and continuity. Children, too, participated. As they walked the lands surrounding the cemetery or the ranches of the region, they learned to follow the cues left by generations before them. A lean of a fence post suggested a detour. A depression in the soil signaled a place to step carefully. A group of stones might mark a boundary or indicate a buried object. These were lessons learned slowly, passed down through both observation and gentle correction. In this way, memory and care became embodied knowledge. One notable instance was recorded in 1961 when a young folklorist named Thomas Hart visited Las Cruces. Guided by local residents, he followed subtle ridges in the soil from the main gate to the Withers vault. Shadows cast by the late afternoon sun highlighted small depressions he would have otherwise overlooked. A slight curve in the path seemed to guide him past a cluster of shrubs planted decades earlier. By the time he reached the vault, Hart realized he had been tracing not only the physical layout of the cemetery, but the layered memory of generations. Paths created by attention and care, preserved in soil, stone, and vegetation. The quiet paths also revealed anomalies that had long puzzled observers. Soil depressions not aligned with any known grave. Stone piles moved slightly from previous arrangements, and shrubs bent or leaning in unusual directions all hinted at subtle interventions over time. These anomalies were not disturbances in the sense of threat. They were markers of observation, evidence that the land and those who cared for it maintained an ongoing dialogue. A quiet negotiation between permanence and change. Through these pathways, the stories and marginal notes of earlier generations came to life. Symbols in ledgers or diaries corresponded to physical alignments. A star drawn in the corner of a page might indicate a stone pile marking the edge of a path. A small arrow could signify the direction to walk, the slope to notice, or the soil to examine. The interplay between paper and land, between notation and physical reality, offered a way to engage with history that was tactile, reflective, and intimate. The patterns extended beyond individual cemeteries and ranches. Across valleys and hills, paths traced connections between landmarks of memory, graves, fences, stone piles, shrubs, and soil depressions. Each path was distinct yet part of a network, a subtle choreography of movement, observation, and care. Observers who followed these paths over time began to see a larger picture, a landscape shaped not by spectacle or urgency, but by the patient accumulation of attentiveness. By evening, the quiet paths took on a gentle rhythm of shadow and light. The ground cooled, and the air carried a faint scent of desert blooms, soil, and distant vegetation. Observers paused frequently, noticing subtle cues: a stone slightly shifted, a shrub's leaves rustling softly, the curve of a path illuminated by fading light. Each step reinforced the connection between land, memory, and human presence. The quiet paths exemplify the principle that attentive observation leaves a trace. They teach the value of patience, the importance of care, and the enduring significance of subtle acts repeated over time. They also hint at the broader narrative of the fading stars. Small details, shifts in soil, arrangements of stones, the lean of a shrub, can carry meaning far beyond what one sees at first glance. Soft hinge to Chapter 8. Following these quiet paths, one eventually encounters evidence of human intervention in the margins. Small objects, notes, and artifacts left intentionally or by chance. The next chapter will explore these tangible remnants, revealing how they link memory, care, and observation across generations. As quiet paths wound through valleys, deserts, and cemeteries, observers often encountered another layer of memory. Objects and artifacts left behind, intentionally or through the gentle passage of time. These remnants were rarely dramatic or ornate. They were simple items: tools, toys, letters, scraps of paper, and small personal effects that carried the imprint of human attentiveness. They served as markers, reminders, and sometimes as unspoken messages across decades, quietly linking past to present. In Las Cruces, the Withers children's plot yielded some of the most compelling examples. Alongside shrubs planted to mark the edges of graves, one could find small tokens tucked carefully into soil depressions. A tiny carved figurine, a small coin, a carefully folded scrap of paper. Each object was placed with deliberation, sometimes by families visiting the cemetery, sometimes by caretakers maintaining the site. Their presence offered subtle evidence of care, a way to maintain continuity, even when the reasons were not immediately apparent. Observers noted that these objects were rarely conspicuous. A figurine might sit partially buried, its details softened by wind and dust. A scrap of paper might be tucked beneath a stone or pressed into a furrow in the soil. To notice them required attentiveness, patience, and a willingness to move slowly through the landscape. The objects acted as guides, much like the quiet paths themselves, directing observation without the need for urgency or spectacle. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain types of objects appeared repeatedly in multiple locations. Small stars carved into wood, coins placed on stone piles, scraps of paper folded into triangles. Researchers and folklorists began to recognize these patterns as forms of communication, symbolic gestures that reinforced memory and attentive care. They were not warnings or messages of danger, but markers of observation and presence, signaling to future caretakers that the land had been tended, noticed, and respected. Artifacts were also recorded in marginal notes and diaries, creating an interplay between paper and physical object. A ledger might include an entry noting that a small star was placed by the eastern shrub, or a coin left beneath stone pile. Cross-referencing these annotations with field observations revealed a network of intentionality. The objects served as anchors, connecting oral memory, written record, and the land itself. Children and families participated in these practices naturally. A child walking the cemetery or the surrounding fields might leave a small token near a stone pile or pressed into the soil, adding their own layer to a story that had already accumulated generations of care. These acts were not ceremonial in the formal sense, but habitual, rhythmic, and quietly attentive. The placement of objects, like the walking of paths, became part of the tacit pedagogy of attentiveness, learning to observe, to mark, and to honor the land and its memory. Even seemingly mundane items could carry meaning. A rusted tool left leaning against a fence post, a bucket partially buried beside a well, or a shard of pottery tucked beneath a shrub could all function as quiet markers. To the casual observer, they might appear inconsequential. To the attentive eye, they revealed sequences of care, evidence of repeated observation, and continuity across decades. They were artifacts of attentiveness, objects imbued not with material value, but with significance derived from action and intention. Folklorists visiting the region in the 1950s and 1960s documented these artifacts with meticulous care. One researcher noted that a tiny carved wooden star placed on a stone pile corresponded exactly to a star sketched in the margin of a diary entry from 20 years prior. A small coin beneath a shrub matched a note in a ledger about a family visit to the cemetery. These correlations revealed a network of memory that extended across objects, land, and paper, creating a layered, tangible system of care. The act of observing these artifacts was itself instructive. Those who paused to notice the small figurines, coins, or notes learned the rhythms of the land. They became attuned to subtle changes in soil, the placement of shrubs, and the curves of paths. Each artifact was a waypoint in a larger pattern, reinforcing the importance of patience, attentiveness, and consistency. The landscape itself, populated with these quiet remnants, became both a teacher and a guide. Over decades, the accumulation of artifacts formed a subtle archive, accessible not through grand structures, but through careful attention. The combination of object, path, and marginal note offered a record of human presence, observation, and care that transcended individual memory. Even as families moved away, diaries were misplaced, and shrubs grew wild, these traces persisted, quietly encoding a history of attention into the landscape. Artifacts also carried lessons in humility. They reminded observers that significance is often subtle, layered, and cumulative. A small figurine or coin left decades earlier held no dramatic power, yet its presence conveyed meaning to those who paused to notice. It was a quiet affirmation that attentiveness and care could endure, quietly shaping understanding without spectacle or alarm. In the broader post-war context, these objects and artifacts reflected a culture of attentiveness that extended beyond cemeteries. Farmers, ranchers, and families placed small markers in fields, along paths, and near water sources. Tools, stones, and personal items were arranged with subtle deliberation, creating networks of meaning that reinforced ethical attention, continuity, and observation. Objects became both mnemonic and moral, shaping behavior as much as recording memory. By evening, the artifacts seemed to harmonize with the land itself. Shadows lengthened over shrubs and stone piles, wind stirred dust and leaves, and the faint scent of desert blooms mingled with the warmth of sun-soaked soil. Observers, walking slowly, pausing to note a figurine or a coin, felt the continuity of generations. They recognized that care, observation, and attentiveness left tangible, enduring marks, linking human action to memory, land, and story. Soft hinge to Chapter 9. The artifacts and objects, though silent, carried accumulated knowledge. In the next chapter, we explore the rhythms and routines that maintained these traces over decades, the quiet work of care and attention that transformed observation into enduring stewardship. In post-war Appalachia and New Mexico, the act of care became a quiet ritual practiced daily, weekly, and seasonally. It was less about ceremony than about attentiveness, the rhythmic tending of soil, the careful alignment of stones, the adjustment of fences, and the observation of subtle changes in plants and landscape. These rituals were both practical and reflective, bridging human presence with the enduring memory of those who had come before. Morning light illuminated the first gestures of care. Children and adults alike moved with deliberation along familiar paths, checking the condition of shrubs, ensuring that small stone piles had not shifted, and observing soil for signs of moisture or disturbance. Tools were handled with care. A hoe pressed gently into the earth, a trowel tracing the furrowed lines of a garden, a brush used to clear dust from a stone marker. These repeated acts, executed quietly, ensured continuity across seasons and generations. Even the smallest gestures mattered. A coin placed beside a stone, a leaf carefully removed from a vault lid, or a scrap of paper folded into a triangle could carry layers of significance. These acts were not intended for others' attention. They were part of an internalized rhythm, a practice of observation that reinforced both memory and connection to the land. In these routines, attention was its own reward, and continuity its own affirmation. Weekly rituals offered slightly longer spans of attentiveness. Fences were inspected and reinforced where needed. Tools were cleaned, sharpened, and stored methodically. Paths were walked to check alignment, soil compaction, and plant growth. Observers moved deliberately, noting patterns, adjusting minor deviations, and recording details in marginal notes. Each week, these routines reinforced previous care, ensuring that subtle markers, stone piles, soil depressions, shrubs, and objects remained coherent, aligned, and legible to those who might follow. Seasonal rituals, however, offered the deepest sense of continuity. Spring was for planting shrubs, arranging stone markers, and refreshing soil. Summer brought careful monitoring of growth and alignment, adjusting water flow or soil density where necessary. Fall involved preparing the land for dormancy, ensuring objects and artifacts remained in place, and recording notes about any anomalies. Winter was a season of observation and reflection, a time to review marginal notes, plan adjustments for the coming year, and honor the patterns established over decades. In Las Cruces, the Withers children's plot exemplified these practices. Caretakers moved slowly among the vaults, shrubs, and markers, observing each detail. Small artifacts, left intentionally or by chance, were checked and repositioned if needed. Marginal notes were reviewed to confirm alignment with paths, stone piles, and objects. These rituals required patience and attentiveness, but they ensured the persistence of memory, encoding care into the landscape itself. Even small anomalies were incorporated into ritual practice. A shrub leaning slightly from wind, a stone nudged out of place by rainfall, or a soil depression that had changed subtly, were not ignored. They were observed, recorded, and adjusted as needed. The rituals were adaptive, responsive to the environment, and grounded in respect for both land and memory. Over time, these small corrections maintained coherence and reinforced the layered network of attentiveness built across generations. Children, too, participated in these rituals. They learned by imitation and gentle guidance, aligning stones, adjusting soil, or checking paths for signs of change. These lessons were not formal instruction, but absorbed practice, internalizing attentiveness as both ethic and habit. The rituals became a form of embodied knowledge, linking hands, eyes, and mind with landscape, objects, and story. The cyclical nature of these rituals reinforced broader patterns of continuity. Daily, weekly, and seasonal practices ensured that the markers of memory remained legible and meaningful. They connected observers to previous generations, linking individual action to collective stewardship. Attention became habitual, and habit became continuity, a quiet promise that care would endure even as human presence shifted over time. In addition, rituals of care strengthened community. Families and neighbors worked alongside each other, sharing knowledge, aligning practices, and observing results together. The repetition of these tasks, carried out in low-arousal attention, fostered subtle bonds, linking individuals to each other and to the landscape itself. Conversation was minimal but meaningful, often focused on observations, anomalies, or subtle shifts in the land. The shared rhythm of care reinforced both trust and understanding. Some rituals extended beyond human hands. Wind, rain, and sun contributed to the maintenance of markers, assisting in subtle adjustments. Observers recognized these influences, adapting their routines accordingly. A leaning shrub might be guided, but the natural curve of its growth was respected. A soil depression was noted and incorporated into path alignment. These interactions between human action and natural forces emphasized attentiveness, patience, and collaboration, blurring the line between stewardship and partnership. By evening, the effects of ritual were visible in subtle ways. Stone piles aligned, shrubs leaning gently as intended, soil furrows clearly defined, paths smooth and legible. Small artifacts rested in their places, marginal notes had been updated, and the land itself seemed to breathe, stabilized by the accumulation of quiet care. Observers felt a sense of continuity, a reassurance that attention, repeated and sustained, could persist across generations and landscapes. The rhythms of these rituals also reinforced memory of the fading stars. Marginal notes, objects, and paths were maintained with attentive consistency. The quiet repetition embedded understanding into human behavior, ensuring that subtle patterns, shifts in soil, placement of objects, and alignment of paths remained coherent. The rituals transformed observation into stewardship, encoding memory not only in paper and artifact, but in land itself. In this way, rituals of care offered lessons for both present and future observers. They demonstrated the value of patience, attentiveness, and adaptability. They highlighted how subtle, repeated action could preserve memory and maintain alignment between human activity and natural systems. And they provided reassurance that attentive action, even in modest or humble forms, could endure, quietly shaping understanding, behavior, and landscape for decades to come. Soft hinge to Chapter 10. With rituals of care maintaining the landscape and artifacts, the next layer of observation emerged. Subtle patterns in time and space that hinted at recurring phenomena. In the following chapter, we explore these rhythms, observing how the accumulation of care intersects with natural and human cycles to form enduring patterns. As the land of New Mexico stretched under the muted warmth of the sun, observers noticed more than objects, artifacts, or quiet paths. They began to discern subtle rhythms and patterns, repeating cycles of soil shifts, plant growth, shadows, and light. These patterns were not loud or insistent. They emerged softly, revealed through careful attention and sustained presence. Over decades, they intertwined with rituals of care, marginal notes, and the quiet actions of generations, forming a network of understanding both temporal and spatial. The rhythms were evident in everyday observation. A shrub might lean slightly in the direction of prevailing winds, a depression in the soil deepened after each rainfall, or shadows fell differently as the seasons progressed. The careful alignment of stone markers created gentle undulations along the land, reinforcing natural cycles of light and shadow. Observers recorded these changes, noting patterns in journals and marginal notes, often without conscious urgency. The process was meditative, a way to attune to the subtle pulse of the landscape. In the Withers Children's Cemetery, rhythms were particularly evident. Small artifacts left decades earlier remained in place, yet their relationship to the land shifted with changing seasons. Coins reflected sunlight differently depending on the angle. Small wooden figurines cast long shadows at dusk, and soil depressions responded predictably to moisture, swelling slightly in the morning and settling by afternoon. These recurring behaviors formed a quiet clockwork, providing observers with a sense of continuity, a way to read time without watches or schedules. The rhythms extended beyond the cemetery. Across the valleys, gentle arcs of shrubbery, alignment of stone piles, and slight elevations in soil created pathways of pattern that guided movement subtly, naturally. Farmers and caretakers recognized these cues. A leaning shrub suggested the best approach to a water source. A series of small ridges indicated a safe route for tools, and subtle depressions marked the edges of fields previously tilled. Patterns reinforced attentiveness, and attentiveness reinforced the patterns, forming a continuous feedback loop of observation and care. Marginal notes often referenced these patterns indirectly. A star in a corner of a ledger might indicate a recurring shift in soil, or a series of arrows might trace the seasonal movement of shadows across a grave. Researchers later piecing together these notes found that the community had encoded natural rhythms into their records, mapping land and memory in a quiet, sophisticated language of care. These records offered insight not only into the physical landscape, but into the ethical and attentive mindset of past generations. Observers began to recognize longer-term cycles as well. Over years, patterns in vegetation, soil, and artifact placement revealed trends that spanned decades. Shrubs planted by caretakers in one generation grew into natural markers for the next. Stone piles shifted slightly over time, but maintained alignment relative to other markers. Small artifacts moved in response to environmental changes, yet their positions retained relational meaning. These long-term patterns reinforce the principle that careful observation, combined with sustained, gentle action, leaves enduring traces. Children learning these rhythms absorbed them organically. Walking along quiet paths, noting small objects and observing shadows, they internalized cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. The land itself became a teacher. Patterns guided them without instruction, offering lessons in patience, attention, and the slow accumulation of care. These lessons were never rushed. They were absorbed in the rhythm of daily life, passed from generation to generation through observation, repetition, and reflection. In the broader context, the rhythms of the land intersected with human practices. Rituals of care reinforced natural cycles, while attention to objects, marginal notes, and paths aligned with seasonal changes. Winter's stillness prompted reflection and review. Spring and summer encouraged active maintenance and observation. Fall suggested preparation and continuity. Together, human and natural rhythms created a landscape alive with layered meaning, subtly recording the passage of time and the imprint of care. Some patterns were nearly imperceptible. Slight depressions in the soil, almost invisible from a distance, would guide a careful observer to a stone pile, or a lean in a shrub suggested the proper angle for walking along a path. Repeated observation revealed that these subtle cues were intentional, or at least maintained intentionally over decades, integrating human attentiveness with the natural tendencies of the land. In this way, memory, observation, and care coexisted seamlessly, a quiet choreography between people and environment. Over time, the accumulation of rhythms, patterns, and artifacts revealed a deeper narrative. The fading stars, the symbolic traces left in marginal notes, objects, and careful gestures, were not merely commemorative. They encoded an ethic of attentiveness, a philosophy of care, and a continuity of human presence. Patterns in the landscape mirrored patterns in the practices of observation. Shadows, soil, shrubs, and artifacts worked together to create a living record, a network of quiet knowledge available to those willing to notice. Even in the evening, as the sun dipped behind distant mesas and the desert air cooled, the rhythms persisted. Shadows lengthened across stone piles, soil settled into familiar depressions, and shrubs swayed gently in the wind. Observers paused, noting the subtle interplay of light, shadow, and object placement. Each cycle was a quiet reassurance. The land remembers, care endures, and attentive observation leaves lasting marks. The patterns also offered perspective. By noticing recurring movements and alignments, observers recognized that continuity was achieved not through dramatic action or extraordinary events, but through repeated, gentle attentiveness. Memory, ethics, and care were interwoven, each reinforcing the other. The land itself served as both canvas and record, bearing the imprint of human and natural rhythm alike. Finally, the accumulation of these rhythms, patterns, and quiet observations created a landscape imbued with coherence. Every shrub, stone, artifact, and marginal note contributed to a subtle orchestration of continuity. Observers realized that even the smallest gestures, placing a coin, noting a shadow, straightening a stone, participated in a larger network, a silent testament to attentiveness across generations. Loop back and sleep permission landing. As night settled over New Mexico, the land exhaled quietly. Shadows softened, wind whispered through shrubs, and distant mesas glowed faintly in the moonlight. The rhythms continued, unnoticed yet enduring, as if the very earth itself recorded the care, attention, and memory of countless hands. For the listener, this is the gentle reminder. You may rest now, trusting that attentiveness, care, and quiet action leave traces that endure far beyond any one lifetime. Even in the quietest stretches of the post-war landscape, memory persisted. It whispered through soil, stone, and shrubbery, through marginal notes, artifacts, and the gentle curves of paths. These were not memories shouted aloud, nor stories told for attention. They were subtle, embedded, and cumulative, carried by the attentive gestures of generations. Walking the land was to enter a dialogue with the past, to recognize patterns of care and reflection that had endured despite the years. Observers described a gentle resonance when encountering the Withers Children's Cemetery. It was not the grandeur of monuments that commanded attention, but the meticulous layering of objects, artifacts, and shrubs. Each gesture recorded in time, each adjustment repeated and maintained. Shadows, soil depressions, and stone alignments combined with marginal notes to form a network of cues, subtle yet perceptible, guiding attentive observers along quiet paths. The land seemed to exhale, offering recognition to those willing to notice. Whispered memories emerged in unexpected ways. A small figurine tucked beneath a shrub, a folded scrap of paper pressed into soil, or a coin resting on a stone could trigger recollection, linking the present moment with decades past. These artifacts were not symbols of tragedy. They were markers of attentiveness, reminders that care had persisted. Each whisper of memory invited observers to pause, reflect, and continue the cycles of observation that had shaped the landscape. The repetition of care and attention reinforced these whispered memories. Daily, weekly, and seasonal rituals ensured that paths remained legible. Shrubs were guided, stone piles aligned, and small artifacts preserved. Marginal notes recorded adjustments and observations, creating a parallel layer of memory on paper. Together, these practices formed a dense network of remembrance, a landscape layered with quiet attention, observation, and reflection. Children contributed naturally to this network. Their gestures, though small, added layers to memory. A coin placed beneath a stone, a small mark made in soil, or a careful alignment of a twig reinforced continuity. Observation became embodied knowledge, passed from generation to generation, and whispered memories were strengthened by attentive repetition. In this way, the landscape itself became both teacher and archive. Even seemingly subtle anomalies carried significance. A leaning shrub, a shifted stone, or a slight soil depression invited careful study. Observers learned to read these cues without alarm, understanding that small changes were part of the ongoing dialogue between land, artifact, and human action. These quiet adjustments reinforced attention and memory, strengthening continuity rather than introducing disruption. Patterns of light and shadow further animated whispered memory. Afternoon sun highlighted subtle curves in the land. Moonlight reflected off a coin or artifact, guiding attention to markers that might otherwise have been overlooked. Shadows shifted over stone piles and shrubs, revealing alignments and relationships established decades prior. Observers learned to read these temporal patterns as part of the network of memory embedded in the landscape. Across valleys and fields, whispered memories connected communities. Families shared knowledge, guiding children and neighbors along paths, pointing out artifacts and interpreting marginal notes. Memory was collaborative, reinforced through attentive observation, storytelling, and ritualized care. Each gesture of attention, each careful adjustment, contributed to the collective archive of human presence in the post-war landscape. The Withers children's plot exemplified this principle. Every artifact, shrub, and path carried meaning beyond its immediate form. Coins, figurines, and scraps of paper were preserved not as curiosities, but as markers of attention. Observers moving through the landscape absorbed the quiet rhythm of care, internalizing gestures and practices that linked them to previous generations. Memory, in this context, was less about personal recollection and more about sustaining attentive action over time. Whispered memories also emphasized continuity and reassurance. By noticing patterns, artifacts, and cues, observers gained a sense that human action, when sustained with care, endures. Land, objects, and paper combine to form a quiet archive, resilient yet gentle, providing subtle guidance and affirmation for future attention. This perspective reframes memory not as loss, but as ongoing presence, encoded in gesture, object, and soil. In the fading light of evening, whispered memories became perceptible as rhythms. Observers paused to notice shadows stretching across stone piles, shrubs swaying with the breeze, or a coin catching the last rays of sun. Each perception reinforced the continuity of care, the persistence of attentive action, and the layered presence of those who had maintained these landscapes before. The land itself seemed to murmur, offering recognition and quiet guidance. The cycle of whispered memories encouraged reflection. Observers recognized that each small act of care contributed to a network of attentiveness that transcended decades. Marginal notes, artifacts, paths, and shrubs all carried traces of human thought, action, and observation. The landscape, informed by these layers, offered both instruction and reassurance. Small, deliberate gestures endure, shaping memory and continuity over time. Finally, whispered memories were also invitations. They suggested attentive engagement, careful observation, and patient stewardship. They reminded observers that memory is not only recalled, but created and maintained. By walking paths, noting artifacts, adjusting shrubs, and recording observations, the present generation participated in the ongoing dialogue that had begun long before and would continue long after their own footsteps had faded. Soft hinge to Chapter 12. Whispered memories, carried in soil, shadows, and small artifacts, form the prelude to reflection. In the next chapter, the narrative expands to integrate these observations, revealing how attention, care, and continuity converge into a broader understanding of human presence, ethics, and the enduring imprint of action. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, painting mesas and valleys with muted amber, the echoes of continuity became perceptible across the post-war landscape. These echoes were not loud or forceful, but subtle and persistent, carried in the alignment of stone piles, the placement of shrubs, and the deliberate positioning of artifacts. They were traces of attentive care, rhythms of observation, and the patient maintenance of memory across decades. Each echo signaled the presence of those who had come before, guiding observers in the present with quiet assurance. In Las Cruces, the Withers Children's Cemetery exemplified this principle. Stone markers and small shrubs had been maintained with consistent attentiveness, artifacts positioned with care, and marginal notes preserved to document changes, anomalies, and adjustments. Every repeated gesture, from the placement of a coin to the alignment of a stone pile, reinforced the rhythm of continuity. The landscape itself became a repository of attentive action, a record of human stewardship intertwined with natural cycles. Observers noted that continuity was reinforced through repetition, both in practice and in ritual. Daily, weekly, and seasonal routines ensured the maintenance of paths, the care of shrubs, and the preservation of artifacts. These gestures were not grand or ceremonial. They were subtle, rhythmic, and imbued with intentionality. Over time, they formed a dense lattice of continuity, connecting generations through attentive action. The echoes were perceptible not only in objects but in behavior. The quiet, deliberate movements of those tending the land mirrored those of their predecessors. Artifacts played a central role in sustaining these echoes. Coins, wooden figurines, scraps of paper, and other small objects acted as anchors in time and space. Their positions, carefully maintained, guided observers and reinforced patterns established long ago. Shadows shifting over a coin or sunlight glinting off a figurine subtly indicated orientation, prompting recognition and reflection. Each object was a marker, both practical and mnemonic, contributing to a network of continuity that was both physical and ethical. Rituals of care further strengthened continuity. Aligning shrubs, straightening stone piles, and adjusting soil depressions were acts that transcended simple maintenance. Each repetition reinforced the embedded patterns of attention, ensuring that the landscape remained coherent, legible, and meaningful. These acts were also pedagogical, teaching attentive observation to children and newcomers who walked the paths. Continuity was not merely observed, it was enacted, experienced, and transmitted. Observers discovered that continuity was resilient yet adaptive. Slight changes in soil, wind, or rainfall were incorporated into routines without disrupting the broader pattern. Shrubs might lean slightly, stone piles shift imperceptibly, or artifacts settle in new positions. These minor variations did not undermine continuity. They were acknowledged, adjusted, and integrated, reinforcing the principle that attentive action can endure through flexibility and responsiveness. Echoes of continuity extended beyond the cemetery. Across valleys, fields, and scrublands, human attentiveness interacted with natural rhythms. Paths aligned with water flow or topography. Shrubs and vegetation marked seasonal changes, and artifacts responded to the cycles of sun, shadow, and wind. Observers noted that attention, care, and observation created an invisible web linking human and natural systems, a layered record of activity that persisted quietly but meaningfully across decades. Whispered memories, carried in soil, objects, and marginal notes also contributed to continuity. Small gestures, placing a coin, recording an observation, adjusting a stone, were repeated across generations, reinforcing rhythm and structure. The echoes were cumulative, forming patterns that could be discerned only through patient observation. They reminded observers that continuity was not the result of singular events, but the accumulation of small, deliberate actions over time. Children learning these practices absorbed continuity naturally. Their attention to artifacts, shrubs, and paths mirrored the patterns established by elders. Each act, though subtle, contributed to the ongoing narrative of attentive care. Continuity was thus not static. It was enacted through embodied knowledge, reinforced through repeated action, and integrated with both human and environmental rhythms. In this way, the landscape became a living teacher, transmitting understanding across time. The ethical dimension of continuity was also evident. Attentiveness and care were not merely functional. They were moral acts, affirming the presence, dignity, and memory of those who had preceded observers. Each adjustment of a stone pile, each careful alignment of a shrub, each repositioning of an artifact reflected respect, consideration, and intentionality. Continuity was not simply procedural, it was ethical, connecting generations through attentive action and deliberate preservation. By evening, the echoes of continuity resonated across the land. Shadows lengthened over stone piles, shrubs swayed in gentle wind, and artifacts reflected fading sunlight. Observers paused to notice subtle patterns, aligning their own gestures with the rhythms embedded in soil, object, and marginal note. The landscape exhaled softly, affirming that attentive care, repeated over decades, had established a coherent and enduring record. Finally, the echoes of continuity offered reassurance. They demonstrated that human action, when executed with patience, attentiveness, and ethical intent, leaves lasting traces. Memory is not only a recollection, but an ongoing practice. Observation, ritual, artifact placement, and marginal recording collectively form a layered archive that persists quietly across generations. For those walking these paths, the echoes provide both guidance and affirmation, a gentle assurance that care endures beyond individual presence. Soft hinge to Chapter 13. With continuity firmly established through attentive action, ritual, and artifact, the final chapter will reflect on the cumulative meaning of these practices. We will explore how observation, care, and memory converge into understanding, and offer the listener a gentle sense of closure, affirmation, and rest. As night gently settled over the desert valleys and mesas, the land seemed to pause. Breathing softly beneath a muted sky, shadows deepened among shrubs. Stone piles glimmered faintly in the last traces of twilight, and small artifacts, coins, wooden figurines, folded scraps of paper rested quietly in their carefully maintained positions. This was a landscape shaped by attentive hands, rhythmic action, and enduring care. In these final moments, observers could sense the full circle of continuity, care, and memory converging into a quiet reflection. Walking slowly along familiar paths, observers noted how each element, soil, stone, shrub, artifact, told a story of attentiveness. Daily routines, seasonal rituals, and careful adjustments over decades had left a cumulative imprint. Marginal notes, preserved and referenced across generations, reinforced the network of observation. patterns of light and shadow, soil depressions, and the placement of objects all carried meaning, gently guiding understanding without demanding urgency. The land itself had become a living archive, shaped by cumulative action and attentive care. Artifacts, once small and almost inconspicuous, now revealed their quiet significance. A coin resting on a stone, a figurine tucked beneath a shrub, or a carefully folded scrap of paper reflected gestures repeated over decades. They were markers of memory, of care, and of continuity. Observers understood that these items were not relics of the past alone. They were active participants in a dialogue between human action, natural rhythm, and attentive observation. Each artifact contributed to the ongoing story of the landscape, whispering reassurance to those who noticed. The Withers Children's Cemetery, observed over decades, illustrated this principle vividly. Stone piles were aligned carefully, shrubs guided with gentle hands, and objects preserved in deliberate positions. Marginal notes documented small adjustments and observations, encoding understanding into both paper and soil. Observers discovered that continuity was achieved not through grand gestures, but through consistent, patient action. Small movements, repeated with attention and intention, accumulated into lasting care, forming an ethical and temporal archive that transcended individual lifetimes. Even anomalies were embraced as part of the landscape's narrative. A shrub leaning from the wind, soil slightly shifted by rainfall, or an artifact moved subtly by time was integrated into ongoing practice. Observers adapted their rituals with sensitivity, maintaining patterns without imposing rigidity. The interplay between human attention and natural processes reinforced the ethical dimension of care. Continuity is resilient because it respects change, responding to it with gentle attentiveness rather than force. Children walking the paths absorbed these rhythms naturally. By observing, adjusting, and participating in rituals of care, they internalized knowledge through experience rather than instruction. Every gesture, realigning a stone, adjusting soil, noting the position of an artifact, reinforced patterns established long before. Memory, observation, and action merged into embodied knowledge, carried forward by each generation with quiet assurance. Whispered memories, embedded in soil, shadows, artifacts, and marginal notes, now converged into a larger reflection. Observers realized that memory is not solely recall, but ongoing attentiveness. Careful action leaves tangible traces. Observations, when repeated and sustained, transform land, objects, and paper into a living archive. Each gesture accumulates, and the cumulative effect is continuity. A landscape enriched by ethical attention, rhythmic action, and mindful observation. The natural rhythms of day and night, light and shadow, wind and soil also contributed to this archive. Subtle cycles guided attention, highlighted artifacts, and revealed patterns. Observers learned to harmonize with these rhythms, aligning their actions with the pulses of the land. Human and natural rhythms coexisted, creating a layered sense of order that was both observable and felt intuitively. Continuity, in this sense, was not imposed. It was cultivated in partnership with the environment. As darkness deepened, observers found a gentle stillness. Paths became quiet, shrubs swayed softly, and stone piles rested in deliberate positions. Artifacts caught the faint glow of moonlight, casting long, calm shadows across the ground. The rhythms established over decades, daily care, weekly observation, seasonal rituals, now echoed silently, affirming that attentive action endures. Memory was not lost. It had been encoded in land, object, shadow, and soil, ready for those willing to notice. The ethical dimension of this continuity remained clear. Care, attentiveness, and patience were not merely procedural. They were moral acts, affirming presence, memory, and responsibility. Each gesture, no matter how small, reflected deliberate thought and respect. The cumulative effect of repeated action over time was a landscape both functional and meaningful, a testament to human attentiveness and ethical stewardship in a post-war world. Finally, the full circle of observation, ritual, artifact, and reflection offered a sense of completion. The echoes of continuity, whispered memories, rhythms, and patterns converged into understanding. Observers recognize that attentive action leaves enduring marks. Small gestures, repeated over decades, create continuity, preserve memory, and reinforce ethical attention. Care is its own record, and attentive action its own archive. In this quiet conclusion, the landscape exhaled gently. Shadows softened, shrubs swayed, artifacts glimmered faintly, and marginal notes rested in place. The observer's path through time and space reached its natural pause, allowing recognition of both past and present, action and memory. There was reassurance in the persistence of care, the layering of attentive action, and the accumulation of small, deliberate gestures across generations. Sleep permission landing. You may rest now, knowing that the land remembers, care endures, and attentive observation leaves lasting traces. Shadows, artifacts, shrubs, and stone piles continue their quiet dialogue, reflecting the continuity of human action and the gentle rhythms of the post-war world. The full circle of care, observation, and memory is complete, offering both comfort and reflection as night embraces the landscape. Dawn arrived gently, brushing mesas and valleys with muted light that softened the edges of stone piles and the curves of shrubs. The landscape, still heavy with the weight of attentive care, exhaled quietly. Across the desert, shadows lengthened and retreated, tracing the contours of paths well tended over decades. In this quiet continuum, human presence, memory, and natural rhythm converged seamlessly, forming an enduring dialogue that stretched beyond any single life or generation. Observers walking these paths recognized the persistence of gestures, large and small, stone markers carefully aligned, shrubs guided with patience, coins and wooden figurines resting in deliberate positions. Each element signified continuity. The land itself became a living archive, recording the attentiveness of countless hands through time. Marginal notes, weathered but legible, detailed subtle observations and minor adjustments, echoing practices that had long shaped the terrain. Together, these signs formed a network, perceptible only to those who moved deliberately, with patience and attention. Daily routines had accumulated into layers of memory. Each adjustment of soil, each careful placement of a shrub, each artifact aligned with sunlight and shadow reinforced a rhythm of care. Observers noted that continuity was both fragile and resilient. Fragile because it required consistent attention, resilient because small, repeated gestures, executed mindfully, accumulated into durable patterns. These patterns were not rigid. They adapted to wind, rain, and seasonal shifts, blending human attentiveness with the pulses of the natural world. Across the Withers Children's Cemetery, this quiet continuum was most visible. Every artifact, every stone, every shrub reflected the actions of those who had come before, as well as the attentiveness of current observers. Even minor anomalies, slightly leaning stones, shifted soil, or artifacts displaced by weather, were integrated gently, without disruption, into ongoing care. The interplay between adaptation and attention reinforced a sense of stability, continuity, and quiet trust in the processes of both nature and human action. Children moving through these spaces absorbed this continuum intuitively. They noted shadows stretching over stone piles, aligned shrubs and artifacts resting in deliberate positions. Each small act, straightening a stone, adjusting a shrub, recording a note, reinforced the patterns established over decades. Observers recognized that this embodied practice, repeated quietly over time, became a way of learning attentive care without instruction. Memory, ethical attention, and rhythm converged seamlessly in gesture and observation. Whispered memories, already embedded in soil, objects, and marginal notes, now coalesced into a broader sense of understanding. Observers realized that memory was less about recollecting the past and more about sustaining action in the present. By attending to artifacts, adjusting soil, and observing patterns, the attentive participant contributed to a continuum that extended backward and forward in time. Memory became active, enacted through repeated gestures and patient observation. Patterns of light, shadow, and movement reinforced this understanding. Morning sun highlighted small depressions, reflected faintly off coins or figurines, and drew attention to stone alignments. Wind brushed shrubs, subtly suggesting orientation. Even the rhythm of human footsteps traced across familiar paths echoed long-standing gestures, integrating movement with the accumulated history of the land. Observers felt guided not by instruction, but by pattern, repetition, and quiet resonance. Rituals of care had become the backbone of this continuum. Daily, weekly, and seasonal routines maintained alignment, recorded observations, and ensured that artifacts remained positioned. Each gesture, however modest, reinforced patterns established long ago. Continuity was created not through dramatic acts, but through cumulative attentiveness, a gentle rhythm that shaped both landscape and understanding. The ethical dimension of these actions became apparent. Attention and care are forms of respect, linking human presence to memory and environment. Even subtle shifts in the land were meaningful within this continuum. Shrubs leaning with the wind, soil depressions expanding after rainfall, and the displacement of small artifacts were observed, adjusted, and incorporated. These minor variations did not disrupt continuity, they enriched it. Observers understood that the resilience of attentive care lay in adaptability, the ability to notice, respond, and integrate changes without disrupting patterns. Human and natural rhythms coexisted in harmony. Across the desert and valleys, observers began to perceive a larger pattern. The network of care, artifact, and observation stretched far beyond any single location. Paths, shrubs, stone piles, and artifacts collectively encoded memory, ethics, and attentiveness across space. Marginal notes recorded observations and adjustments, creating temporal depth. Together, these elements formed a quiet, enduring continuum, a living map of attentive human presence and ethical engagement with the land. The Withers Children's Cemetery stood as a concentrated example of this continuum. Its artifacts, stone piles, and shrubs had been tended for decades, but their significance extended beyond this single location. Observers moving carefully through the wider landscape discovered that similar patterns existed elsewhere. Repetitions of attentive gestures, embedded rhythms, and layered memory. Continuity was therefore not local alone. It was systemic, a shared practice of observation, care, and reflection that linked communities across the post-war world. Nightfall brought the continuum into focus. Shadows deepened, shrubs swayed gently, and artifacts caught faint moonlight. Observers paused to notice how cumulative action had created order, meaning, and reassurance across the landscape. Memory and attention persisted through repeated gestures, patterns of care, and ethical observance. The land itself seemed to breathe, sustaining the dialogue between past, present, and future. Finally, the quiet continuum offered reassurance for all observers. Human action, when executed with patience, attentiveness, and ethical care, endures. Memory is created and maintained through repeated, mindful gestures. Observation, ritual, artifact placement, and careful adjustments form a living archive, resilient across decades and generations. Shadows, shrubs, stone piles, and coins all participate in this dialogue, reflecting the enduring presence of attentive human action. Soft sleep permission landing. You may now rest, knowing that care, observation, and memory continue quietly in the land. Patterns, echoes, and whispered traces persist, reassuringly present as the post-war world exhales under moonlight. The quiet continuum endures, gently affirming that attention, patience, and care leave lasting marks beyond any one lifetime. The desert stretched wide and still under the pale glow of dawn, a canvas of mesas, scrubland, and gentle shadows. The wind moves slowly, brushing over shrubs and stone piles with a whispering touch. Even the smallest artifacts, coins, figurines, scraps of folded paper, seem to breathe with the rhythm of the land, quietly echoing decades of care. In this final chapter, observers were invited to trace the culmination of attentive action, whispered memory, and ethical presence, discovering the full meaning of continuity across generations. Walking along familiar paths, one could perceive the layered textures of the post-war landscape. Soil depressions marked repeated attention, shrubs leaned subtly in response to gentle guidance, and stone piles retained deliberate alignments. Artifacts rested in positions shaped by decades of careful placement. Marginal notes, weathered but legible, offered records of observation, adjustments, and thoughtful reflection. The land was not empty. It carried the enduring presence of attentive humans and the rhythm of natural cycles intertwined. Observers recognized that continuity was formed not by dramatic events, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate gestures. Each action, straightening a stone, adjusting a shrub, noting a subtle shift in soil, was a thread in a larger fabric. These threads wove together, linking generations across decades, establishing an archive of ethical attention and thoughtful care. Memory, observation, and action were inseparable, forming a quiet, resilient network. Even minor anomalies contributed to this continuity. A shrub leaning from wind or soil shifted by rain was not a disruption, but an invitation to attentive adjustment. Observers integrated these subtleties gently, maintaining the coherence of patterns while respecting the rhythms of nature. Human care and environmental processes existed in harmony, each shaping and responding to the other. Adaptability was part of continuity, reinforcing resilience without demanding control. Children moving through these spaces absorbed patterns instinctively. Shadows over stone piles, sunlight on artifacts, or the alignment of shrubs guided understanding without words. Every small gesture they performed, placing a coin, adjusting soil, noting an observation, reinforced the ongoing archive. Memory and care were embodied, transmitted through attention, repetition, and rhythm, forming a continuum that stretched backward and forward in time. Artifacts themselves, tiny, deliberate objects, told the story of attentiveness. Coins resting on stone, piles, figurines tucked beneath shrubs, or folded papers pressed into soil were markers of past care, offering guidance and reassurance. They reminded observers that memory was created and sustained through repeated, mindful actions. Each artifact was simultaneously functional and mnemonic, contributing to both continuity and ethical stewardship. Observers noted patterns in light, shadow, and movement. Dawn highlighted subtle depressions, artifacts reflected faint sunlight, and shrubs suggested orientation and paths. Footsteps traced long-standing gestures, integrating human movement into the archive of attentive action. The landscape itself seemed to pulse gently, affirming the presence of care and observation in every corner. The ethical dimension of this continuum remained evident. Attentiveness, patience, and care were moral acts, linking generations and affirming memory. Stone piles, shrubs, artifacts, and marginal notes were expressions of respect for both the past and future. Each gesture contributed to a resilient, meaningful landscape, demonstrating that continuity is sustained not through force or urgency, but through patient, deliberate attention. As the day progressed, observers felt the full circle of attentive action and memory converge. Whispered echoes of past gestures, patterns established over decades, and repeated rituals of care created a landscape both legible and reassuring. The continuum was complete. Memory, observation, ritual, and artifact merged seamlessly, forming a living archive that extended across time and space. Even the smallest details were significant. Shadows that shifted over stone piles, shrubs responding subtly to the wind, and artifacts catching glimmers of sunlight all reinforced the rhythm of attentive care. Observers could see that continuity is cumulative. Small gestures, repeated over decades, create a durable and meaningful presence, quietly shaping both landscape and understanding. Finally, night approached once more. Shadows deepened, wind whispered across the desert, and artifacts rested in their intentional positions. Observers paused, feeling the resonance of decades of care and attention. Memory, ethics, and observation had converged into a stable, enduring pattern. The land itself exhaled softly, affirming that attentive action leaves lasting marks. Sleep permission landing. You may now rest, knowing that the continuum of care, observation, and memory continues quietly in the land. Stone piles, shrubs, artifacts, and marginal notes persist in their deliberate arrangements, reflecting decades of attentive human presence and ethical stewardship. The last light fades gently, leaving reassurance, reflection, and calm as companions in the quiet post-war world.